Welcome everyone to the latest Burning Archive podcast on the Russian-Ukrainian NATO crisis. It's the 18th of March, Australian time, Friday the 18th of March. And what I'm going to do today is just go through a quick update on the four vectors of the conflict that we've been looking at in these podcasts: military, diplomacy, information war, economic war, and then talk a little bit about an overall issue. There's been a lot of talk about Russia making a gross strategic mistake in its invasion of Ukraine. I want to entertain, for argument's sake, the possibility that perhaps America has made a gross strategic miscalculation in its provocation of Russia and its reaction, I guess its economic war reaction to the invasion of Ukraine. First of all, let's have a quick look at the military situation. And so, again, the situation seems to be the major cities from central, south and east of Ukraine are sort of surrounded. The main Ukrainian army is in the east, in the sort of Donbass area, is surrounded, and in fact there are now multiple encirclements of key areas with supplies and that sort of thing cut off. And there have been some significant developments, particularly in the city of Mariupol in the last couple of days, with large part of that city now being under Russian control, so that there have been tens and tens of thousands of humanitarian refugees able to leave the city, and reports from many of those, or some of those refugees, that they had been used as human shields during the course of the battles there. And being kept by human shields by the sort of Azov battalion brigade of the Ukrainian forces. But it's tremendous news that a large number of those civilians are now able to leave the city. The situation seems to be sort of in a kind of a lock situation, with a few offences and counter-offensives and slow progress being made. But Ukrainian forces, from what I can read, are basically sort of dug in heavily defended positions with diminished supplies and cut off from any major communication supply lines and the sort of buddies. And there's also just been reports just in the last couple of hours of attacks on as yet unidentified targets. I assume they're probably military targets in the city of Lviv, which is the sort of main city in the east of Ukraine. And of course there was earlier in the week a major bombing of a Ukrainian/NATO establishment in the east of Ukraine, including one which had quite a few Western mercenaries in it. So that seems to be the situation. I think it's dawning on people that the Russian approach has been one of limited conflict, mitigating civilian casualties, and not wanting to be overly punishing. And although that imposes costs on Russia in terms of not overwhelming Ukraine very, very quickly, it does serve perhaps its broader political goals, and it is being done in concert with the diplomatic arrangements, the diplomatic negotiations, which I'll talk about in a sec. There was a very interesting interview on The Grey Zone, which is a sort of like I think it's available on YouTube, but also as podcast and on multiple other video platforms, with Colonel Douglas McGregor, about the nature of the military conflict and the nature of the military situation, and highly recommend people assess that. And he basically dismisses a lot of the talk about Russia not achieving its objectives. He basically confirms this analysis that I've been putting here and that I've been reading on a range of websites and through channels like the Duran and others, that Russia has gone in, if you like, in a cautious way rather than a shock and awe sort of way, and it's executing its plan successfully. Always any battle plan is executed with setbacks, but it's executing its plan successfully, and in Douglas Macgregor's words, the war is in effect settled. But there may well still be a couple of weeks of conflict still to go, and in that time, of course, the pressure for diplomatic negotiations will increase, especially if a city like Mariupol falls comprehensively to Russia, because with the fall of Mariupol is also the fall of the main Azov battalion, which is likely to reveal compromising evidence for the Ukrainian government. Okay, so that's track number one. If you have a chance, I would check out Douglas Macgregor's interview on the grey zone. On diplomacy, again, there's been a lot of action over the last week. There's been a fourth round of talks between Ukraine and Russia, and reports of a range of proposals and plans, including broadly a plan for a neutral Ukraine of some sort or other. The Ukrainian position is sort of jumping around all over the place a little bit, and so seems to be a little bit hard to pin down, and the extent to which they are a constant and reliable negotiator is also a little bit hard to ascertain. Just on that, there was a significant interview that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave with a TV channel, RBC TV channel, on the 16th of March, in which he comments on this topic, that he says neutral status is being seriously discussed in a package with security guarantees. This is exactly what President Vladimir Putin said at one of his news conferences. There are multiple options out there, including any generally acceptable security guarantees for Ukraine and all other countries, including Russia, with the exception of NATO expansion. This is what is being discussed at the talks. He goes into some talk about that and does make a couple of comments that's expressing a degree of frustration with the way in which the Ukrainian negotiators are sort of saying things in public before the sort of international audience and sort of changing their positions. But he says, hopefully the first attempts at a business-like approach that we are seeing now will prevail, and we will be able to reach specific agreements on this matter, even though simply declaring neutrality and announcing guarantees will be a significant step forward. The problem is much broader. We talked about it, including from the point of view of values such as the Russian language, culture, and freedom of speech, since Russian media are outright banned and those kind of things. So there does seem to be slow and inconsistent progress being made in the diplomatic talks between Ukraine and Russia. But again, they will be interacting with the military situation. I guess if there's a significant collapse in the military situation of Ukraine, and it sounds like Mariupol may be comprehensively controlled by Russia within, people are estimating anything from 1 to 7 days, then that's likely to exacerbate things. And similarly, the situation with the sort of eastern forces is likely to also escalate matters. And I guess the fact that the eastern city of Lviv is now, which has been a bit of the safe haven, I guess, for the Ukrainians has been bombed in the last few hours. It's probably also going to escalate pressure on Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky has made a number of appearances on, by video phone speeches at the US Congress and other places where he sort of urged America to provide him weapons and arms and to close the skies and similar sorts of things. There continues to be a great love for or admiration, I guess, for Volodymyr Zelensky as a wartime hero, I guess. I myself still really question the morality, as indeed, for example, Major General Bakshi, formerly of the Indian Army, questions the morality of urging people to fight in a no-win situation. But yes, he's certainly been out and about, and it's very hard to kind of work out, I guess, what the clear and consistent Ukrainian position is, and I suspect there is tension between the US position, like whether they want to draw out the war and how they want to handle it, what their assessment of the likelihood of the Russian success is, and how quick that will be. And how much sort of moral pressure they will be putting on Zelensky to come to a peace deal. And similarly, there is certainly a sort of, glory for Ukraine. Let's go out in a blaze of glory sort of. There is a group with that kind of attitude, military, national honor above all other things, sort of attitude that has some strength. But I guess if one of the centres of that group at Mariupol is comprehensively defeated in the next few days, that may also have a dramatic effect. There was also a lot of diplomacy involving America pressuring other countries, including countries like China and India, over the last couple of days to support the American and NATO position on Ukraine and Russia. And notably, the National Security Advisor, for the United States of America, Jake Sullivan, and his counterpart from China, Yang Jiechi, who has a different title, but I can't quite remember the title, had a meeting in Rome on, I think, Tuesday or Wednesday, which turned out to be a 7-hour meeting, which, is variously described as intense and robust and all those kind of things. And prior to the meeting, Jake Sullivan was putting out to the media that he was warning China of severe consequences for China, including potentially economic sanctions, that would arise if China did not criticize Russia or sort of support Russia in its economic or military resistance to the American position. And it was a remarkably unsuccessful meeting, even in terms of the coverage from the sort of, I guess, Western press of Jake Sullivan's account of things. And when you looked at the sort of Chinese media's account, it would seem that the Ukraine issue was just one among a small number of issues, and in particular there was a long discussion of the situation on Taiwan, which was effectively, I guess, a warning from China to America to get back in its box. And another Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said that defended China's position on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and this spokesperson, Zhao Lijian, is quoted as saying, countries that believe that they have won the Cold War so they can dominate the world, countries neglect others' concern, and pushed for 5 rounds of NATO expansion, and countries that have waged wars around the world but blamed others should truly feel uncomfortable. I don't think there's any much chance of that. And indeed, later today, sometime, Friday American time, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping are going to have a phone call. And the Global Times quotes an anonymous official to the effect that the United States requested a phone call between Chinese President Xi Jinping and US President Joe Biden out of considerations of bilateral relations, promoting peace talks and urging the US to take the right stance. China accepted the proposal. China will never accept, and I'm quoting here still from the Global Times, which is kind of a mouthpiece, I guess, for the Chinese government. China will never accept US threats and coercion, but will urge the US to fulfill Biden's commitment of not seeking a new Cold War, changes in China's system, a stronger alliance against China, or supporting Taiwan secessionism. So probably the next podcast I do on the Ukraine situation, there will be significantly more developments out of that. I suspect there will be an element of Xi Jinping telling Joe Biden to stand down, and in particular to stand down a little bit on the economic war, because some of the worldwide consequences of that are becoming rather clearer. But we shall see. Hopefully it won't be an escalation of conflict into Taiwan, but it will be interesting also to see, I guess, what the sort of American media and American elite reaction to that will be, because I guess China will want not to humiliate Joe Biden. And of course, the other significant development on the diplomacy front is, I believe, just today again, Russia has asked for a further UN Security Council discussion of the biolabs in Ukraine issue, which is following the discovery, Russia says, of the discovery of further documents suggesting significant American involvement in planning some kind of bioweapons targeting perhaps Russia in Ukraine. Quickly looking at that evidence, there's a range of documents and signatures and seals and that sort of thing, as well as some indications that potentially there seems to be a link between some of the research that was underway in these biolabs and some otherwise unexplained mass outbreaks of avian flu and the like in both Russia and the EU in recent years, as well as some other mass illness outbreaks in Ukraine itself. So we shall see where all of that goes. But again, complex situation, very undecided situation still really on the diplomatic front, and still thankfully a firm position from the American military not to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine that would precipitate World War III, despite some of the urging of the crazier American elite, the more militant defense industry linked American elite. And of course, I didn't mention that highlight of international diplomacy, which was Joe Biden describing Vladimir Putin, another head of state, as a war criminal. I guess probably also the level of the rhetoric from both Russia and America towards each other has intensified greatly. And indeed, I mean, some of the rhetoric from the American political leaders towards the nations who have not wanted to take a position, like China and India, has also been quite astonishing. So Anthony Blinken made some comment that India needs to think about how it will be, seen in the history books, and the United Kingdom scored the world's victory for tact in condemning India for its position on Ukraine, And I'm sure India, which after all suffered enormously from the colonial exploitation of Britain, will take that with all the seriousness it deserves. The information war remains incredibly depressing, but there seem to be a few cracks opening in the many of the main channels, and a few people starting to openly doubt whether they aren't being marched into the same disastrous course that happened with weapons of mass destruction in the Iraq War in the early 2000s, in which there was a similar chorus of patriotic uniformity and good versus evil sort of rhetoric, and with disastrous consequences, not least for the country where American arms went to fight. The highlights in the information war over the last week has been the White House of America inviting 30 TikTok influencers to come in for a special briefing from the National Security Council to spread messages like Russia is losing the war, that there's no way that Russia can win this war, and that sort of thing. So they're certainly going all out to persuade the public with reason and good sense and real evidence and balanced judgment on matters of history when they're asking TikTok influencers to be the main advocates of things. There have been a couple of disgraceful incidents, I guess, in the TikTok war, including former American Ambassador Michael McFaul, I think it might be, claiming, perhaps as a mistake, perhaps in a sort of overexcited, passionate moment, that Putin was in fact worse than Hitler because at least Hitler didn't kill ethnic Germans. And he has been rightly criticised for all of that. I think he might have retracted his comments somewhat belatedly. And there is a little bit of more exposure of some of the extreme views of the extreme nationalist brigade from Ukraine, including a disgraceful tweet or piece of messaging from the Ukrainian National Museum, I think. Let me just check that. I have it here, the Ukrainian Institute of National something or other. Can't quite work it out. But anyhow, maybe a National Historical Research or anything. It had a number of comments, including comment that Ukrainians and Russians have different origins, which basically says that Ukrainians originate from the pure Slavic, or from the Slavic tribes, and the Russian nation was formed to a large extent through mixing also the Slavic nations with Ugro-Finnish tribes, Miroma, Mimia, Wez, Mechera, Moshka, Perm, Novara, and others. What is there to say? But all of them are taken to that visible to the naked eyes. There we go. So, yes, some of that sort of racialized or ethnicized, perhaps, prejudice and theories about behavior, including portraying Russians as, I guess the barbaric Mongol races, mixed races, inherently violent and all the rest of it, certainly seem to be pervading some of these things. Don't want to get too much into all of that, but the information war is noticeable. But there are a couple of, I guess there seem to be a few lonely voices, including perhaps my own, that are at least questioning the sense of just madly rushing into another disastrous war, and those people seem to be at least breaking through a little bit, some of the people who are starting to question things. Finally, the economic war. Again, I guess this is a really complicated one to sort of capture, but it does seem to be, there certainly seem to be signs of resilience amongst Russia. I think I talked about that a little bit last week. Certainly seem to be signs of resilience about Russia and growing concerns about the economic consequences, including, food shortages and that sort of thing in not very wealthy countries in the developed world that are starting making people question, well, have you overcooked things here? And I guess the other significant things that seem to be happening is questioning whether Russia, Iran, China, India, and the Gulf states, potentially Brazil, might also establish some sort of commodities-based currency alternative to the US dollar, and also that some of the Gulf states might start trading their oil in rubles or yuan, again reducing the status of the United States dollar as the global currency. So potentially there has been a bomb set up underneath the American House of Finance. We shall see. I might sort of have to do a dedicated program on the economic consequences of war talk. So the last sort of kind of point I really wanted to make today, trying to keep the show reasonably brief, is this question of strategic confusion amongst the American elite. They're really all over the place. There are a lot of people who, whether for propaganda purposes or not, are, convincing themselves that Ukrainians are just about to, Russia's about to run out of ammunition or been defeated already, or the rest of it. But the general consensus is that, Russia has made drastic mistake, and that may be true. I think Vladimir Putin's made a significant speech in the last couple of days where he's effectively said it was, I was left with no choice kind of thing, and that we need to overthrow the sort of aggression from the West. But I do feel that it's at least arguable that the West, or America, has made a major miscalculation. Certainly they have been provoking Russia constantly with the eastward expansion of NATO and the creation of a sort of a Ukraine as a sort of a thorn under the saddle of a burr under the saddle of Russia, a source of instability, a spearhead of regime change in Russia. But I think there are signs too that in their response to the invasion, there has been a massive miscalculation of their diplomatic, economic, and their diplomatic and their economic power, as well as their ability to control, I guess, the sort of world order. Maybe the economic one we can go into in a later episode that looks specifically at the economic war, because it's complicated, but there does seem at least to be signs such as, that undermining of the US dollar and the unintended impact on inflation and the unintended impact on global food security, which is a diplomatic disaster for America, a sort of a recklessness and irresponsibility about its decisions on economic sanctions. And especially if some of the measures put in place by Russia effectively counter some of the sanctions, and it does seem to be that the ruble is stabilizing, and it does seem to be that there's no kind of meltdown in the domestic economy of Russia, at least not yet, then there does seem to be a misjudgment on the use of those sanctions. Indeed, many people are saying that particularly Europeans are going to greatly regret their participation in these things, putting at risk their energy supplies from Russia, having a dramatic impact on food and energy prices amongst the rural populations, and provoking a significant refugee crisis in Europe as great, if not greater, than the Syrian refugee crisis of a few years ago. I mean, must be about 3 million people now, and then there were also quite a lot of Ukrainians who were sort of resident in Europe, I guess, prior to that, who may not sort of be wanting to return. So, let's say somewhere between 2-5 million Ukrainian citizens wanting to find a new economic life within the European Union at the same time as its energy system is collapsing and its food prices are increasing. Not great. Some people have even described the response of America and the European Union somewhat colourfully as creating an economic circular firing squad. Similarly, there has been a sort of diplomatic grandiosity, I think. The comment I quoted before about Tony Blinken saying India needs to be on the right side of history. The miscalculation in terms of trying to publicly shame China into changing its very strongly stated positions on its support for Russia, the vain neo-colonial attitude of Britain telling India that it needs to sort of follow the British line on Russia, the growing alienation of Africa from the position, and the sort of reports of temper tantrums from American officials and rather pressure tactics directed to African political leaders and diplomats, and the fact that the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, have really not come to the party at all. And even within Europe, countries like Hungary have peeled off a bit, and one wonders with a few weeks and some different facts on the ground and more evidence of the consequences of some of the rash judgments, whether there will be a big price to pay for Europe's diplomatic response to this. NATO may be more united than ever, but it may be united on a false path. And the most astonishing thing, I think, has been just the confusion amongst the American responses, the extreme, unhinged emotional reactions of people. This crazy veneration of Zelensky, the references to people being traitors if they even question things, and the reckless discussion of no-fly zones and sending old, nearly redundant jets over to somehow sort out the situation in Ukraine, but make sure that no Americans are at risk. There does seem to be, I think, also some element of a embarrassment there. And I can't remember who I heard make this comment, but the basic comment was that there's a lack of strategic empathy amongst so many in the imperial elite in America, the diplomatic, political, security establishment in America, what I like to call the war imperial faction. There's a lack of strategic empathy, a simple understanding of the kind of things that Russia has been raising for 15 to 20 years about being treated with fairness and respect, and legitimate security concerns, with an understanding of the complex cultural intertwining of Ukraine and Russia. Surely it can't have taken that much more empathy to realise perhaps pushing Ukraine into NATO was a miscalculation and a threat to peace. Indeed, there's an article, I haven't quite got the author of this article, but an article about Ukraine as a Swiss Mongolia or a neutral state, saying the fact that the neutrality argument is finally being spoken by Ukraine and Russia to each other, even if it is still just at the beginning of bargaining at a formally recognised negotiated table, and the West seems diplomatically amenable, means three things for the global community. First, whatever the overall loss of life in Ukraine because of the incursion, it could have been easily avoided. Second, this new status for Ukraine is likely the superior option, not because it is best for any one side, but exactly because it leaves all sides a little dissatisfied, but able to claim political contentment. Third, it is finally time that all sides abandon their Cold War instincts when it comes to dealing with each other and start recognizing the need to establish a new 21st century relationship that isn't stubbornly frozen onto the logic and suspicions of the 20th. That stubbornness sacrifices innocent lives and prevents innocent, innovative peace in favour of familiar discontent and mistrust. It is time the world became disenchanted with this familiarity. I think a little bit of strategic empathy could go a long way. And this idea that a lack of strategic empathy has led to America and I guess the broader Western world making some catastrophic mistakes is actually an idea expressed by the veteran journalist, political commentator Martin Jakes, who wrote a book, When China Rules the World, The End of the Western World and the Birth of a New Global Order, in 2009. He recently was interviewed on CGTV and expressed an idea you might have heard broadly articulated also on the Burning Archive podcast previously. So let's just listen to that just to confirm that I'm not totally off my rocker in some of these assessments.
Now, if you hear Russia's arguments alone, it is all about the relationship between the West and Russia that has led to what is going on now, Russia's military actions against Ukraine. Whether we believe that or not is one thing, but what is the nature of this relationship between the West and Russia from your perspective?
The problems in the relationship have been going on for a very long time. I mean, basically since the 1917 revolution. If one takes the whole historical sweep of it. But the key moment is obviously the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the American response to this. And I think looking back on it now, it's clear that America made two absolutely cardinal errors after 1991.
What do you mean?
Well, the first of all, America believed that it was now the sole superpower. This was the unipolar moment. It was capable of doing anything, hence the Iraq War, the occupation of Afghanistan, and so on. And we all know that that was a huge mistake. So American hubris after 1991 led to two fundamental errors. That was one. And the second one was how it treated Russia. Because it basically treated Russia as a defeated nation. I mean, it could have had a different kind of relationship with Russia, but it opted not to do that.
What do you mean?
So,
like maybe that the U.S. had with the European countries after World War II, that the U.S. could treat Russia then that way?
Europe is also obviously very important in relationship to this, but to try and find ways of establishing ties and contacts and trade and an atmosphere around the relationship, which was positive. And to do that, the West needed to take into account Russian interests and Russian security. And basically, they didn't do that. They treated it as a defeated nation. And the result is what's happened now, which is suddenly, Russia's done something which in effect tears up the relationship since 1991.
Do check out other people's viewpoints. Do pay some attention to them. And I hope that might help, navigate a way through this crisis. Okay, that's all from me on the Burning Archive. I'm going to be back in a day or so with a non-Ukraine episode on dragons and dragon slayers. Perhaps that is a Ukraine-related episode. I don't know, but a non-geopolitics episode in any case. And I'll be back. Maybe I'll do another Ukraine episode in about a week, and hopefully there will be more positive developments at that stage. Although I think just the seriousness and ramifications of this are still becoming clear, and I think people might want to check out whether, I think you can get it on YouTube and that sort of thing, the speech Vladimir Putin made in recent days, where he basically said, Russia is sort of separating from the West, which it fills me with grief and horror in a way, and deep remorse, really, for the failures of our leadership classes in not being able to have negotiated a decent and honourable peace to the end of the 100 Years Cold War. Anyhow, let's hope things turn out better than a worst case scenario. And in the meantime, do remember Ezra Pound's wise words from the P's and Cantos, written at the end of World War II, while Ezra Pound was in a cage, locked in that cage for speaking out against his own government, in support of the enemy of his government, and, to be frank, in support of some pretty horrible things. But nonetheless, he said, "What thou lovest well will not be reft from thee." Bye now.